August 24, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The war was over, but the silence that followed was unbearable. Inside a hastily built wooden barrack draped in mosquito netting, 30 Japanese women sat on benches salvaged from ammunition crates. Their khaki uniforms had been stripped clean of rank insignia. Their notebooks, blank government-issued, rested neatly on their knees. At the front of the room stood an American lieutenant with a chalkstick in one hand and an interpreter beside him. On the board behind them, written in large, neat English letters, was a word none of the women dared to say aloud: democracy. The instructor smiled, a polite, measured expression that felt entirely foreign here. Through the interpreter, he welcomed his students. No shouting, no drills, just quiet, deliberate courtesy. The same women who once swore loyalty to an emperor now stared at a foreign word that promised a new master: freedom of thought. Outside, the tropical air buzzed with flies and the clatter of American trucks unloading crates marked CIE, Civil Information and Education Section. The flag above the camp snapped in the wind, red and white against a pale blue sky the same color as defeat. The women looked at each other in disbelief. Study democracy? To them it sounded less like education and more like humiliation. But the pencil in each of their hands, a weapon turned tool, was about to begin rewriting an entire nation's identity. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked not only the end of one war but the demolition of one worldview. For more than a generation, the Japanese Empire had fused faith, duty, and obedience into a single creed. Emperors were divine, orders absolute, and emotion a private matter. Every lesson from childhood on reinforced the same message: hierarchy is harmony, and freedom is chaos. When that world collapsed, it did so overnight. Cities across Japan lay flattened under the weight of modern warfare. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, each shattered by firebombs. In the rubble, millions of people stumbled through hunger and disbelief. The rice ration dwindled. Inflation devoured what little remained of savings. And into this devastation landed soldiers, engineers, and administrators wearing the insignia of a foreign power. The occupying forces of the United States under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. The American occupation that began in September 1945 was unlike any prior military victory. It was not merely about disarming a defeated enemy. It was about rebuilding a mind, and nowhere was that mission clearer than in the newly created Civil Information and Education Section, or CIE. Its goal was as ambitious as it was controversial: to re-educate the Japanese people, not through threats or propaganda, but through information, debate, and civics. The Americans arrived with chalk, pamphlets, and films instead of rifles. Democracy would not be imported at gunpoint. It would be taught like a school subject. Across the ruins of the Pacific, Allied collection points overflowed with the human remnants of the imperial machine. Among the millions of POWs were more than 4,000 women, nurses, typists, and communication specialists who had served the emperor's cause from Burma to Saipan. Some had tended the wounded, others managed logistics or propaganda units. Many were volunteers from Japan's Women's Army Nursing Corps or the Taishintai military auxiliaries. To their American captors, they were not dangerous. They were a mystery. The U.S. Army's G2 intelligence brief described them as highly trained yet socially conditioned, proud, obedient, unaccustomed to independent thought. To occupation planners, that made them ideal subjects for an experiment in ideological rehabilitation. At first, the women were relocated to Okinawa, Guam, and Manila for screening. Conditions were austere: bamboo huts, field kitchens, makeshift classrooms. The Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment, and the Americans, anxious to prove moral superiority, followed it meticulously. But policy went further than basic care. It folded education into captivity. Funds and personnel were redirected from wartime psychological operations to newly formed reorientation programs. These were small at first: lectures on world affairs, hygiene, and American life. By October 1945, they evolved into full-fledged schools within the camps. For many detainees, it felt surreal. A few months earlier, they had been instructed to die for the emperor rather than face capture. Now their former enemies were offering them pencils and textbooks instead of bayonets. They took their seats in classrooms built with the same discipline that had guided them through barracks, inspections, and hospital drills. But something inside had shifted. The enemy's weapon was no longer fear, it was curiosity. The curriculum began with basic English phrases: I am, we are, freedom. By December, the lessons included American civics. What is a constitution? What is a right? When translated into Japanese, these words lost their punch. The women repeated them dutifully. Yet the questions lingered behind their silence. For the Americans, defending these ideals in classrooms across the ashes of the Pacific was more than moral duty. It was public relations. The eyes of the world were watching whether democracy could rise where nationalism had burned hottest. Quietly, the re-education of Japan had begun, and within its earliest test subject, these defeated, women in khaki skirts and downcast eyes, the clash between humiliation and enlightenment would be most visible. The American instructors called it civic instruction. The prisoners called it shuyo, a word that meant moral reform, and also repentance. Slowly, lesson by lesson, the structure of obedience embedded by empire began to loosen. But the process would not be gentle, because teaching democracy to those raised to worship command was like asking the waves to stand still. In the months following Japan's surrender, the occupation government in Tokyo evolved into a vast machinery of social reconstruction. Under the leadership of General MacArthur and his team of civilians, educators, and linguists, the United States sought not simply to punish Japan, but to reinvent it. That mission was summed up in one phrase coined by the Civil Information and Education section: democracy from within. To the Americans, democracy could be exported through schools, films, and newspapers. To those who had suffered air raids, famine, and unconditional defeat, it often felt more like another occupation order. Among the occupation's earliest targets was the education system itself. Imperial ethics textbooks were recalled and burned. Teachers underwent moral vetting. State Shinto, once the foundation of emperor worship, was dismantled piece by piece. Into its place, the U.S. island of ideology inserted a single directive: the individual now matters more than the state. In Tokyo, the CIE worked through thousands of American and Japanese educators to revise curricula. But in the POW and internee camps across Okinawa, Manila, and the Ryukyu Islands, the lessons carried a sharper edge. Here, re-education began in the most literal way possible, with the conquered. The female POWs attending these sessions were not criminals. They were the product of a culture built upon ritual hierarchy. Many had never spoken freely to a superior, or even expressed opinion without consequence. Their loyalty was muscle memory, not ideology. And yet within weeks of captivity, they were asked to challenge the very principles that had defined their adulthood. Classes followed a pattern: morning assembly, pledge of cooperation, then lectures covering four themes: democracy, human rights, international understanding, and the role of women in a peaceful society. Motion pictures replaced slogans. Among the most frequently screened films were Make Way for Tomorrow and Our Democracy at Work, subtitled in Japanese and narrated by interpreters wary of mistranslating hope. To the women watching, these films were almost unreal. They saw American men and women arguing candidly in town meetings without punishment. They saw female clerks and voters speaking beside men as equals. The images were both enviable and humiliating, proof of what they were told Japan could become, and evidence of what it had failed to be. Behind the scenes, American administrators debated the morality of forcing culture upon captives. Colonel Donald Nugent, a senior officer in the Far Eastern Command's Education Division, wrote privately, "If we can make them understand democracy here, they will become its first missionaries once released." It was a hypothesis tested daily in classrooms bordered by barbed wire. Resistance came quietly. Some women refused eye contact. Others performed politeness while holding inward scorn. They copied English words neatly, never intending to use them. But the occupation was patient. Politeness, curiosity, and fatigue would do what ideology could not: open space for thought. One breakthrough came not from lectures but discussion. At a camp near Naha in early 1946, an instructor wrote the word freedom on a chalkboard and asked the women what it meant. The translator hesitated. No equivalent word existed with the same nuance. After a long pause, one internee muttered, perhaps not fearing authority. It was a small definition. For the Americans, it was a milestone. While male prisoners were often assigned to labor units or work details, the women's re-education remained intellectual. They were required to write essays about post-war Japan's future, sketching visions of equality and reconstruction. Some wrote cynically, others earnestly. One notebook preserved in U.S. Army archives contains a single line written in careful Japanese. We were told we lost the war because we had no freedom of conscience. Now we are asked to practice it under guards. From frustration and irony grew dialogue. By 1946, the Occupation Authority expanded the initiative into a broader civilian program. The reorientation curriculum used for POW camps became the foundation for Japan's nationwide civic education. Female teachers, many drawn from those same camp graduates, began introducing ideas of democracy in village classrooms. Yet in those first months, humiliation and enlightenment were inseparable. The idea of being educated by conquerors landed as an insult. Still, day by day, repetition eroded resentment. Politeness softened fear. Curiosity replaced shame. The Americans succeeded not because they preached democracy, but because they behaved as if it already existed. Instructors said, "Please." Guards said, "Thank you." Orders became requests. That courtesy, observed so cautiously by defeated Japanese women, carried more power than ideology ever could. And from this uneasy classroom revolution, the story turned personal, the human struggle beneath the policy. For those women behind the wire, democracy was no longer just a word on the board. It was an invitation they didn't yet know how to answer. For the women sitting on those wooden benches, defeat was not merely political, it was spiritual. Every part of their identity had been built on obedience to hierarchy. They had served doctors, officers, or spiritual superiors without hesitation. Now, surrounded by former enemies who smiled instead of barked orders, their certainty dissolved into bewilderment. Psychologists attached to the American occupation studied the effect carefully. Reports from the Allied translator and interpreter section described a transition from stoicism to emotional fragility, noting how captured female auxiliaries exhibited guilt, disbelief, and shame when treated humanely. They had braced for humiliation. Politeness became more disarming than punishment could have been. Letters smuggled from these camps show fragments of introspection rarely recorded in wartime Japan. "They teach us to speak," wrote one woman to her sister, "but it feels like learning to breathe on another planet." The humiliation lay not in the lessons themselves, but in realizing that their captors expected opinions from them. Individuals taught their voices were irrelevant. In teaching equality, the Americans forced them to confront the emptiness self-silencing had left behind. And so what began as indoctrination from above shifted slowly toward discovery from within, a psychological turning point hidden behind silence and bowed heads. For the United States, Japan's moral reconstruction was more than principle. It was geopolitical imperative. The Pacific War's cruelty had convinced Washington that a rearmed, vengeful Japan could never be allowed to return. Education, not occupation alone, would secure peace. Behind the classroom walls of places like Sugamo and Okinawa stood a complex bureaucracy. The Civil Information and Education section employed thousands of teachers, translators, and women administrators drawn from the Women's Army Corps and civilian agencies. Their directive was precise: explain democracy, avoid arrogance, and show its practicality in daily life. Lesson plans arrived directly from Tokyo headquarters. Pamphlets titled Freedom and Responsibility, illustrated civics maps, and leaflets asking, "What does it mean to vote?" Every session doubled as psychological analysis. Feedback flowed up the chain of command. Officers documented reactions, vocabulary comprehension, and attitude shifts. The Americans did not call it propaganda, but it functioned as such: benevolent indoctrination replacing the authoritarian mold with participatory habits. Teaching manners, and civic duty became strategic tools alongside demilitarization and economic aid. General MacArthur called these efforts the spiritual disarmament of Japan. The phrase itself revealed the calculated purpose behind compassion, a reformation designed to ensure that democracy took root before resentment could return. Every hour inside those classrooms was a battle between languages shaped by opposing civilizations. English phrases like freedom, rights, and citizenship resisted exact translation. Their Japanese counterparts carried echoes of duty, not liberty. The interpreters became unlikely diplomats, inventing grammar for concepts that had no roots in Imperial Japan's social soil. Americans encouraged open discussion, urging the women to debate ideas aloud. At first, the silence was suffocating. In their culture, contradiction equaled disrespect. To voice disagreement with an instructor, especially a man, felt shameful. A symbolic clash unfolded around the blackboard itself. In Japanese schooling, the instructor wrote while students copied perfectly. Questions were interruptions. The Americans asked volunteers to write answers. No one moved. Eventually, one timid nurse approached, chalk shaking in her hand. Beneath democracy, she wrote a kanji meaning order. The class nodded like an instinctual defense, as if even freedom required hierarchy to be endured. That chalk mark captured the culture gap perfectly. The U.S. saw liberty as empowerment. The Japanese, shaped by centuries of feudal discipline, saw it as potential chaos. From that misunderstanding would emerge one of the most profound dialogues in modern history: how to share the idea of freedom with those who feared it. Each of these perspectives, human confusion, American design, and cultural clash, set the stage for even deeper layers still unfolding inside those barbed wire classrooms. Gender, morality, and the slow moral conversion of a defeated empire through kindness and curriculum. In both nations, gender carried contradictory expectations. Under the empire, Japanese women had been guardians of purity and endurance, their lives defined by ryosai kenbo, good wife, wise mother. They served the imperial army as nurses, clerks and communicators, yet remained excluded from command or political voice. When capture came, social identity collapsed completely. The Americans, however, saw women as the key to long-term reform. Across the Pacific, female personnel from the Women's Army Corps and Red Cross assumed instructional roles precisely because their presence disarmed suspicion. They represented a modern ideal of womanhood, confident, literate, and public in expression. Inside the camps, this contrast was direct and visual. Japanese women in patched field blouses faced American instructors with manicured hands and tailored uniforms. The quiet awe of that difference stirred unease and envy in equal measure. MacArthur himself recognized symbolic opportunity. If the women change, the nation changes, he told CIE directors in late 1945. Within months of those early re-education programs, women across Japan gained the right to vote. For the female captives, democracy's first lesson arrived through gender itself: the power of presence, intellect, and self-worth. Attributes once repressed, now personified by the women teaching them. Beyond politics, the occupation carried a missionary current. American chaplains and Christian educators framed democracy not only as a political system, but as a moral order rooted in individual conscience. At Sugamo and other detention sites, chapel tents stood beside classrooms. Attendance was voluntary, but curiosity grew. Services blended sermons with civics, forgiveness, accountability, personal responsibility before God and community. For prisoners raised under state Shinto, where reverence for hierarchy substituted for faith, this intrusion was bewildering. Some interpreted the chaplain's compassion as hypocrisy, religion wielded by victors. Others saw sincerity that punctured their cynicism. Captured nurses who had seen war's worst atrocities began to connect mercy with morality rather than weakness. One interpreter testified to Army intelligence. They began to separate emperor from divinity, and divinity from violence. Whether through scripture or civic duty, the message converged. Morality stemmed from choice, not command. That subtle, redefinition of virtue would ripple far beyond prison fences, influencing Japan's post-war ethics and secular humanism. Everything that unfolded in those hot, crowded classrooms represented a new kind of battlefield. Ideology replacing artillery. The Allied High Command measured progress through attitude surveys and classroom attendance logs. Reports noted that hostile responses declined by a third within 6 months. Military historians would later call this the soft victory, winning compliance through demonstration, not domination. Americans filmed these sessions for propaganda at home, showing uniformed women taking notes under the stars and stripes. For the defeated nation, the optics were humbling but instructive. Newspapers reprinted images of female captives studying democracy, presenting them as symbols of Japan's effort to walk the new road. Soon, civilian people's schools mirrored these lessons outside the camps. Female volunteers trained in occupation seminars returned to teach literacy and civic rights nationwide. What began as humiliation became a model for reconstruction. The irony was profound. The very women once conditioned to sustain the hierarchy of empire became its undoing. Through gender, morality, and policy, the Americans had turned courtesy and curriculum into weapons more transformative than any bomb. And as those experiments matured, they reached a decisive moment. The first clash of conviction and understanding that would turn classrooms into the moral front line of a new era. Tokyo Education Center. November 1946, the city still smelled of ashes. Bombed-out lots stood like missing teeth between blocks slowly rising again under American supervision. In a former army officers' building near Shinjuku, rows of desks filled what had once been a tactical planning hall. Now there were no maps, no operations boards, just blackboards crowded with English words. It was Friday morning in the upper-level reorientation course, an experimental class where 30 former female officers and auxiliaries studied politics alongside a handful of civilian teachers. The lesson that day was citizenship. At the front, an American instructor wrote 2 columns on the board: rights and duties. Through the translator, he asked each student to name an example of both. The silence was dense. Pens poised, eyes down. Finally, one woman, her uniform replaced with a plain gray dress, rose voluntarily. She had been an army nurse stationed in Bataan, captured in 1945. She spoke softly, the interpreter trailing her words. Duty, we understand, right? Maybe to serve well. The instructor shook his head gently. Right to speak, right to choose. He paused while the interpreter struggled to fit those words into acceptable syntax. When the translation came, to choose for oneself, a nervous shuffle spread through the class. The sound of disbelief rendered in fabric and paper. For nearly every student there, choice had been blasphemy. Obedience was perfection. Autonomy, chaos. Yet now their captors insisted that personal will was sacred. To admit it felt like rebelling against ancestry. Then something unexpected happened. The woman who had answered, eyes steady, voice low, asked to write on the board. She lifted the chalk and drew a line between rights and duties. Beneath the line, she wrote in Japanese, "Without duty, freedom dies. Without freedom, duty kills." No one spoke. Even the Americans were silent. It wasn't in the lesson plan, but it captured everything they were trying to teach. After class, word of the statement spread through the compound. Officers recorded it in their reports. The sentence appeared translated weeks later in an internal CIE memo titled, "Evidence of Conceptual Transfer." That phrase, half admission, half revelation, marked the moment when re-education turned from external correction to internal dialogue. The same day, across the hall, American film crews arrived to document progress. They expected staged compliance. Instead, they captured genuine engagement, women raising questions, even disagreeing with instructors. The very act once punished, now applauded. Was the first time in Japanese modern history that former soldiers publicly debated belief under the eyes of foreign rulers. A turning point both symbolic and tangible. Psychologists present that week noted less rigidity, greater candor. American officers called it proof of the democratic habit. But to the participants, it was still raw ambivalence. Freedom felt like exposure. They were learning not what to think, but that thinking itself was allowed. As dusk fell, The women walked back toward their quarters under a sky streaked with distant searchlights still scanning Tokyo Bay. For the first time since surrender, those lights searched not for enemies but for orientation, who they were, and who they might become. What unfolded in that classroom would ripple outward. The experiment's success led occupation headquarters to expand it into nationwide civic programs. But inside each participant, the conflict only deepened. Could moral autonomy coexist with the discipline that had once defined virtue? The Americans called it transformation. The captives called it contradiction. Either way, the empire's silence had been broken by a piece of chalk and a word that refused translation. By early 1947, the quiet revolution that began inside POW barracks had spread far beyond the fences. In classrooms across Japan, from rural Hokkaido to war-scarred Yokohama, echoes of those first lessons took root. The same women who had once sat in neat rows beneath Allied guards were now stepping forward as instructors, themselves living proof that re-education had produced its own apostles. Inside the walls of Tokyo's Education Reform Center, an extraordinary experiment reached its zenith. Former army clerks and nurses, now free but still under supervision, were invited to co-teach lessons alongside American officers. It was a public demonstration designed to reassure the world. Democracy could indeed be learned. Rows of correspondents and Japanese officials filled the back of the hall. The subject of the day was leadership in a free society. A young Japanese graduate, once a Kempitai secretary, stood beside an American major whose tone was precise but friendly. She began in hesitant English. Before, leader is the one who orders. Now leader is the one who listens. The hall erupted in quiet applause, from Americans stunned by her courage, and from Japanese civilians witnessing a social taboo collapse in real time. For 2 years, occupation officials had searched for tangible signs that their moral disarmament policy was working. This moment, recorded in press photographs now housed in the U.S. National Archives, became their evidence. Yet for the women themselves, empowerment carried a strange vertigo. Freedom demanded vulnerability. Without hierarchy's armor, they faced the fragility of choice. Several later confessed that politeness from Americans felt more destabilizing than anger. It forced them to respond as equals, not subordinates. One recalled years later, "When a guard said please, I could no longer hide behind loyalty. I had to decide for myself." This was democracy's truest theater, the small exchanges that required the humility to accept kindness without surrendering dignity. The re-educated officers began applying these lessons to everyday life. They organized camp councils, shared ration tasks, and approached guards with requests instead of silent compliance. The occupation reports noted unprecedented cooperation, not born of fear but mutual respect. Outside the camps, Japan was rewriting its laws. In March 1947, the new constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and gender equality. Article 14 declared, "All of the people are equal under the law." Article 24 redefined marriage as a partnership of mutual consent. Many phrases were translations of ideas first tested by the CIE within POW classes. As Japan learned to speak the language of democracy, the emotional distance between the conquerors and the conquered narrowed. The Americans began to recognize humility in their pupils not as subservience, but as grace, a cultural expression of respect that could coexist with freedom. Photographs from that spring captured the difference. Former prisoners standing beside U.S. instructors at wooden podiums, answering questions, smiling without fear. Their posture remained disciplined, their tone cautious, but something immense had changed: awareness. The journey that began in humiliation had led them step by step to comprehension. The Americans had intended re-education to ensure obedience to peace. Instead, many of these women found authentic dignity for the first time. Dignity that didn't depend on uniform or emperor, but on conscience. When American cameras rolled one last time before shutting down the Tokyo Center later that year, a final image closed the experiment. 2 women, one wearing the armband of a former POW, lowering the stars and stripes as another raised Japan's newly restored flag beside it. No words were exchanged, only a shared nod. It marked not submission, but synchronization, the fragile moment when conqueror and conquered understood the same gesture differently, yet harmoniously. The classroom doors closed soon after, but the ideas born there remained restless. They would accompany these women into the world they were rebuilding, a nation poised to define itself not by surrender, but by what it now dared to believe. The next chapter of that story unfolded quietly, in the everyday lives shaped by that education. The aftermath where humility met independence and ideology gave way to conscience. The formal programs of reorientation ended in 1947, but their effects slipped far beyond the boundaries of barbed wire and classroom walls. When the women who had once been categorized as prisoners walked back into a free but ruined Japan, they entered a nation undergoing the same re-education they had already begun. General MacArthur's Supreme Command for the Allied Powers, SCAP, had extended its ideology into every sector of life. Schools, local governments, police, media, labor unions, the female POWs who had faced the first and most intimate lessons of democracy found themselves among its earliest practitioners. Many of them went first into nursing, once more, this time under civilian hospitals, funded by American relief organizations. Others worked as clerical assistants for SCAP's women's and youth divisions, translating textbooks on civic duty. Their English, once the language of interrogation, became the instrument of reconstruction. American observers wrote cautiously positive reports. A 1948 CIE memorandum noted, "Former internees adapt rapidly to self-administration and display initiative unexpected at outset." The tone was bureaucratic, but the meaning clear. Success measured not in ideology alone, but behavior born of understanding. The same American chaplains and instructors who had taught inside camps now found their students teaching villagers how to vote or read newspapers. The transformation fascinated anthropologists attached to the occupation staff. "The re-educated captives serve as culture carriers," one wrote. "They bring democratic habits, not theories." That phrase, habits not theories, summed up the quiet genius of the policy. Democracy had been introduced through gestures, saying, please, asking opinions, respecting boundaries, thanking even subordinates. Those habits filtered naturally into households and schools. At election time in April 1947, photographs showed women queuing outside polling stations for the first general election in which they could vote. Some of them had been behind fences only a year earlier. Their posture remained perfect, heads slightly bowed, but the act itself was revolutionary. MacArthur's staff considered broadcasting these stories widely, but public sensitivity over re-education of captives remained high. Instead, the transformation proceeded in silence, personal and gradual. The women themselves rarely spoke about humiliation anymore. Many later wrote in memoirs of a second surrender, not to America, but to conscience. "We learned that politeness can be discipline, not submission," wrote one nurse decades later. "The Americans thanked us until we started thanking ourselves." At the time, few recognized how profoundly these human exchanges shaped Japan's recovery. While economists debated aid and planners redrew roads, the foundation being rebuilt beneath the surface was moral. By giving initiative back to those who had once obeyed blindly, the occupation turned defenselessness into cooperation. By treating captives as capable adults, it taught them adulthood in a new sense, autonomy balanced by restraint. And for the Americans, the camp program served as proof that reform through kindness could work faster than enforcement through fear. Reports from other theaters, Germany, Italy, the Philippines, cited Japan as the successful experiment. But success brought unease. Some officers questioned whether re-education had gone too far, producing sympathy instead of repentance. MacArthur dismissed the concern. "Democracy cannot be half-taught," he reminded his staff. "It must be practiced until it is natural." Inside Japan, the practice had indeed begun to feel natural. From classrooms to family tables, the new etiquette of equality wound itself into daily life. Teachers encouraged questions. Fathers congratulated daughters for learning civics. Those who had once sat rigidly through Allied lectures now found themselves standing before eager students of their own. The conquered were quietly teaching others how to live by the rules of the conquerors, yet the knowledge no longer felt foreign. The most remarkable transformation of all was invisible, the redefinition of pride. Where once it meant duty unto death, It now meant the courage to speak honestly and live responsibly. The experiment inside those small military classrooms had succeeded beyond its planner's imagination. And the women whose humiliation began it all were walking proof that even the deepest obedience could evolve into the very independence their captors had hoped to inspire. The occupation would slowly loosen its grip, but the culture of democratic behavior would remain, reshaping Japan through small daily choices. By 1949, 4 years after surrender, Japan was rebuilding not just its cities and factories, but the very grammar of its social order. The Allied occupation still managed policy from above, yet change was now emerging from within, through citizens, who no longer required foreign supervision to practice civic life. Among them, the women who had endured re-education behind barbed wire carried unique weight. In towns from Kyushu to Hokkaido, they resurfaced as teachers, nurses, and journalists. Quietly, they embodied the paradox of Japan's recovery. Obedience turned into responsibility. Shame transformed into strength. The Allied authorities took note. Internal intelligence summaries by the Civil Information and Education section described a measurable enthusiasm for civic participation among reoriented female ex-military personnel. The phrasing was clinical, but the evidence was alive in every classroom and clinic they staffed. Some of these women entered the new Women's Bureau within Japan's Ministry of Labor, created with direct American guidance in 1947. Their training in democratic principles, however involuntary, made them indispensable advocates for workplace equality and literacy. Others joined the Japanese Red Cross, where they taught modern nursing ethics influenced by the American model of compassion, balanced with discipline. The journals of the time speak with quiet amazement. We see young women who once saluted the emperor now instructing boys and girls that no man is born to rule another, wrote a Tokyo newspaper editor in 1948. That transformation was not a miracle born of ideology, but the result of contact, a daily consistency of courtesy, patience, and dialogue that replaced propaganda with practice. American policymakers adjusted to this new dynamic with humility of their own. The era of lectures gave way to partnership. CIE officials invited Japanese educators to co-author materials. Chaplains deferred to local spiritual leaders. Post-war democracy began to develop its own accent, one that sounded neither purely American nor traditionally Japanese. The women who had once sat silently under guard became mediators between these worlds. When interviewed years later, several remembered their initial humiliation as necessary revelation. "We hated the lessons," one recalled, "but they forced us to think as human beings, not uniforms." By the time the occupation formally ended in 1952, those former captives had dissolved into the fabric of normal life. Many refused recognition, fearing stigma for wartime service. Yet their influence persisted. They were among the first generation of Japanese women to vote, to teach civic studies, to supervise hospitals under constitutional equality. The American soldiers and instructors left behind a legacy they scarcely anticipated, not imitation of Western manners, but adoption of its core ethic, mutual respect. Courtesy, once mistaken for weakness, had proven its resilience as a tool of reconstruction. In hindsight, historians call the education of Japan's female POWs a small chapter in a vast occupation record, but its resonance extended beyond numbers. It demonstrated how power could govern without cruelty, how dignity could survive even the deepest defeat. One of the last American instructors wrote in his 1949 journal, "They began by bowing out of habit. They end by bowing from choice. That is the difference between command and consent." From that difference rose an enduring bridge between two societies once divided by ideology and war. The camps were dismantled, the chalkboards erased, yet the lesson left on every heart touched by that experiment remained indelible. That respect, when offered without condition, can rebuild nations faster than any treaty. Through faith in education and human decency, the Americans and their unexpected students had unknowingly shaped the character of modern Japan. The years of occupation would fade, but the echo of those classrooms, the sound of reluctant pencils scratching across paper, learning to spell freedom, would linger in memory as the true aftermath of surrender. And from that echo, history would draw its quiet conclusion, a reminder that even humiliation in the hands of mercy can become the first step toward equality. The story of transformation within captivity now softened into reflection, a look toward what this collision of power, humility, and humanity ultimately revealed about human nature itself. History often records the noise of war, the explosions, the declarations, the triumphs of power. It speaks less about the moments when power learned restraint, when a smile or a please carried more weight than any weapon. In those wooden classrooms of 1945 and 1946, the lessons were unintentionally profound. The defeated learned democracy in its simplest form, and the victors discovered that compassion can command obedience without humiliation. Every arigato that followed an English thank you was a bridge built out of ruined conviction. For the Japanese women who had worn the emperor's insignia, re-education began as discipline and ended as dialogue. For the Americans, the process confirmed that peace could not be drafted on paper alone. It had to be spoken, shared, and lived. The occupation faded into peacetime, but the imprint of those small gestures endured. The women who entered captivity as symbols of empire would later stand as citizens of a democracy they helped to define. They proved that humility need not erase pride, that dignity need not depend on command. From classrooms lined with dust and chalk rose a new kind of victory, a quiet, lasting one. Empires had fought for domination. Ordinary people, stripped of empire, rediscovered humanity. And in that exchange, a conquered nurse's bow answered by an American teacher's courteous nod. The modern world learned what even war could not destroy: the innate human capacity to rebuild, word by word, lesson by lesson, until respect itself became the foundation of peace.